David and Sonia. And, oh, sorry.
And it's Pennie Aitken, who's our project assistant. Hi there. We've written things down because we knew we'd be last, and we just read what we're going to say, and hopefully we can say what we need to say. Sonia and I have a practice that involves the use of sound, video, and various installation elements that are usually placed within specific public sites or architectural contexts. Our aim is to shift how a site is perceived by the visitor. We also maintain a gallery-based installation practice. The work we made in Moora is called The Way You Move Me. We were located in Moora, which is 200 k's north of Perth, and has a population of somewhere around 2,000 people. They're kind of a larger population just outside of Moora. It's a service town. We went up there in the best possible time, and that's thanks to Bryony Mainby, who convinced us to visit in spring, and it's obvious spring would be a good time. The rain had been good, the canola was in flower, the grass was green, unusually, and so was the wheat. The farm animals were very frisky and out and about. The greater Moora region is something like a factory. Like many towns in the wheat belt, so there are huge grain silos on the outskirts of town. Crop dusters were buzzing Moora when we arrived, adding fertiliser and pesticides. One crashed into power lines nearby while we were there. The roads to Moora were always busy, and probably still are, with semis coming and going, and utes with various things on the back, WA&A utes. The land has worked really hard, and it's marginal land, really. A farmer may run sheep in a paddock 1 or 2 seasons, then the ryegrass on which they feed is poisoned, and the ground is reworked with fertilisers, and next year a wheat crop is grown where sheep were the year before. Many Moora residents have no real knowledge of farming or animal care. A teacher told us that her students knew little about animals and farming. They never went out to farms. Many of these kids are Aboriginal kids. The Aboriginal community don't appear to be involved in farming, although we did see some of them working as shearing contractors. The farms around Moora are part of the wheat belt, but they actually run many other crops and livestock. There's even a large wildflower farm. There's also an olive farm and orchards producing oranges. And some say this has exacerbated issues with the water table and salinity issues. Quite a few of the farms we encountered were run by women with husbands working in town, or vice versa. Each farmer we spoke with appeared to have their own take on farming methods, including their own approach to the best way to manage cattle and sheep and the use of dogs. In fact, the farmers we ended up filming had quite contrary views about farming methods. There's a big Aboriginal presence in Moora. The reason for this is an interesting story in itself, and has to do with the 2 missions that were located close by and closed as recently as the 1970s, namely New Norcia and the Moore River Settlement. There's much more that can be discussed about that situation and how it relates to the whole stolen generation issue, but this talk, we can't go there in this talk, unfortunately. The website and printed brochures of Moora don't reveal many aspects of town life. They list things like when the railway came through, when the town was gazetted, and when the town was flooded. There's some murals and sculptures that also allude to settlement themes. For the farming community, the day begins early, ends early, and the farmers only really catch up when they come into town to pick up mail and that kind of thing. There's a couple of coffee shops where they go and have chats. Otherwise, Moora has no cinema, no restaurant other than the pub. The pool's only open for a small part of the year. Though occasionally they get one-off performances from groups who come to town, including the Australian Opera. So it's kind of a bit Some members of the community showed great interest in the project. Many were indifferent to the fact that we were there, and we spoke with lots in the community anyway. I'll just many of the things you'll see in, well, for example, I'm just kind of realised we're running out of time, but many of the flowers you see in our work, it's a wildflower area, and in fact, a local Aboriginal identity, Fred Mogridge, took us to some of the remnant Kwongan bushland and showed us flowers and plants that were used for food and medicine. Many of the flowers you see in our work in the background were filmed in the paddocks, are in fact weeds and escaped cropping plants, things like radish, canola, lupins, capeweed, familiar to farmers. Some of the paddocks we filmed in were recently pockets of Kwongan, original bushland, and not cleared until the 60s. A few remnant pockets of Kwongan that are left still around the area, very few. Both look and sound very different to the farmland. We caught up with Wally Kukov, a local character. Every evening, Wally's house on the outskirts of Moora is visited by a flock of Carnaby's black cockatoos who come to feed. As most of the vegetation that they originally used for food and shelter has been cleared, Wally has taken it upon himself to provide food and some shelters for the birds. It's quite possible that without his help, the birds would have nowhere else to feed. Interestingly, they come to Moora to breed, so you normally see them on the coast at other times of the year. Interestingly, when the subject of the Carnaby's is brought up with the locals, they have nothing positive to say about the birds and accuse them of stealing grain and making a mess on verandas. It seems that there's much more work to be done to turn around the prevailing attitude towards the endangered Carnaby's. You'll see the Carnaby's in our piece. That's just a few little bits, as I can say a lot more, but I'll hand over to Sonia, who will talk about the piece itself. We're going to do a little tag team thing.
During our time in Moora, David and I heard several variants of a similar story that goes something like this. It concerns a night that a sheepdog is not properly locked up for the evening and it leaves the confines of the farmhouse free to roam into the surrounding environs. The following morning, the farmer wakes up with a start. She is startled to discover a large, noisy herd of hundreds of sheep right outside her bedroom window, staring at her with fixed attention. She soon realises that sometime during the evening, a sheepdog has escaped the yard and has spent most of the night herding any available animal, bringing them back to the master's home. The farmer then realises that she will have to now spend all morning relocating the herd back to appropriate parts of the farm. This story is indicative of the sheepdog's innate wish to herd. How left to its own devices, instinct will sometimes kick in, and the sheepdog will herd without any human intervention. During our time in Moora, we observed many different stories from farmers who worked with animals. Each was the result of years of practical study, observing the way their cattle and sheep could be made to move in various ways, while being shifted across the farm to a new paddock, or into the sorting yards, or into a truck for transportation. The farmers had become expert observers of the herd and had found ways to manipulate the herd that utilised the natural internal dynamics of the herd. Farmer Vicky Martin described the challenge of moving her herd of sheep as being akin to moving a large, unwieldy, constantly mutating bubble across the landscape. As she brought the herd of 500 sheep towards us, Vicky slowly and determinedly walked from one end of the herd to the other, directing her sheepdog to keep the long bubble intact. We observed the bubble constantly warping and wobbling as it moved across the landscape, always with the potential to burst away with aberrant tearaway sheep. The Kelpie sheepdogs are there to circle the bubble and convince the tearaways to re-enter the group. Vicky emphasises that there are always productive moments and non-productive moments to drive the sheep forward. There is no use motivating the dogs during an unproductive moment. As she works, she keenly observes the herd, aware that certain leader sheep are driving the herd, and she must wait until the leader sheep have circled into an appropriate position before signalling her dog to create a change in mass movement. She discusses the patience she personally requires to sense the right moment to effect change in the herd. As David and I made the project, we often wondered how much of Elias Canetti's Crowds and Power, with its focus on the dynamics and metaphysics of human crowds, can also be observed in animal herds. In the 1960s, Elias Canetti wrote a study of human crowds in history, and this has been very influential in some of our past projects. Canetti's crowds are the crowds of mass gatherings, street demonstrations, religious gatherings, sports teams, armies of war, and the many other ways that humans come to mass together. In the West Australian herds of sheep and cattle, David and I observed many of the same themes enunciated by Canetti, despite the fact that Canetti's focus was strictly on human crowds. The tendency for any crowd to naturally increase and move together, the build-up of tension in a crowd followed by a dissipation and a discharge, certain crowds being like the orderly progress of a river, certain crowds having the wildness and disorder of the sea, certain static crowds being like a field of corn, with certain actions or commands creating ripples of movements. And Canetti goes on with many, many other crowd symbols, as he calls them, in his kind of 1960s thinking. He was also talking about certain individual disruptions within the mass and a tendency for an increase in density to maximum density, resulting in what he calls crowd stagnation. The idea of panic, overcoming a crowd, and the flight crowd where everybody flees. Canetti notes that often it is safer to all flee together in one direction rather than to disperse as individuals. Crowds and Power also makes a study of verbal commands, and in particular the flight command, the most basic command that instigates a flight away in a particular direction. It is one of the oldest commands in history, akin to calling out a single word like run or go. The best verbal commands are basic, uncomplicated, able to be immediately understood with no possibility of contradiction, such as those simple commands used by sports coaches and military commanders, and obviously the ones used by the farmers when they're herding their sheep and cattle. How are we going for time? Yeah. We spent several days filming the sheepdog trainer Darren Brown, and everything went really well. The shapes and movements of the Brahman cattle were powerful and convincing, and the three Kelpie dogs working with Darren always seemed to appear in our roving camera frame at the best possible juncture. The clouds over the expansive landscape were luminous. Darren worked with his dogs with a calmness and an easy physicality that was evident in each frame. He uses discrete vocal calls and occasional horizontal arm signals to expertly choreograph not one but three sheepdogs that simultaneously circle the herd in racing arcs of containment. He compares his three dogs to using three different tools in a toolkit. Each dog can be engaged in a different function, and the interrelationship of the three dogs seemed unbelievably smooth. Darren's Kelpies are trained not to bark, so the whole process looks skillfully managed without the constant yelping of dogs. And David and I were both impressed with how competent and how confident he always was with his animals, due to close observation and experience built up over many years. But beyond that, there was an aspect to the human-animal relationship that was harder to articulate, but it was still very apparent. It involved a kind of cross-species sensing that occurred beyond language and beyond definitions. And we observed it in all the farmers, but particularly in the way Darren was constantly sensing not only the activities of the herd, but also the activities of each of the three dogs. We also observed it in Darren's three dogs, constantly primed and alert to Darren's subtle movements and limited actions. And we tried to capture these various sensing moments in our artwork, which is called The Way You Move Me. We have certain sections in our piece that focus on the dynamics of containment. On one screen we have Steve and Liz working in the sorting yards, shifting and manipulating the older and younger sheep into different sections of the yard, effectively making two separate herds. And this is what Elias Canetti might call a stagnant crowd, that's constantly increasing to the point where it gets so dense that there's no capacity to move anymore until the moment of release. And David and I paired this on the second screen with a different type of containment, the horse trainer Kari Lee, working with her horse in the barrier of the circular yard, doing circle work, also known as lunging. And we were fascinated by the strict circular pathway of the horse and also the strict rhythms as being practiced as part of the lunging. And with Kari Lee intently following the progress from a central position, her horse performed the routines of lunging, going from walking to trotting to cantering to galloping, each mode requiring the horse to execute a different gait, such as 2-2 or 3-3 or 4-4, picking up speed or slowing down during the shift from mode to mode. And Kari was very subtle in her use of signals, and her almost wordless commands involved tongue clicks, whispers, gentle woes, and as an adjunct to her work with the reins. And both human and animal had evolved an almost silent way of working together, so that the command to shift from a quiet gait to erupt into a canter was almost imperceptible. And I might leave it there and hand over to Pennie, who I must say was our really awesome and hard-working project assistant. She was one of the great positive aspects of our many weeks that we spent in Moora.
Thank you very much, Sonia. You're very, very kind. I know the time is very short, so I will keep it very brief. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very fortunate to have been involved in assisting Sonia and David on the project. They made it a very enjoyable experience, and I learnt so much about myself, the community, and about the diversity of art itself. David gave a great introduction about what our community is, and it seems there is a common thread throughout regional Western Australia and likely Australia, and that is in these small communities it's very sports based. There's a lot of money, a lot of resources put in there, a lot of effort, a lot of time, and arts really just gets put to the side as being a bit of a folly. And we all know how enriching when we engage in art, it really becomes, you know, so much more in our life. As a result, in our community, 11 years ago, the Moora Fine Arts Society was established. That was to provide local people with opportunity to view and become involved and participate in arts. Otherwise, 2 hours we're travelling to Perth to see something and possibly even further. So, like many other communities, with that the enthusiasm waxes and wanes, and really it is the people on the ground. Shires are also an important and valuable part of bringing arts to the community, and without their help and assistance we really aren't going to get anywhere. So a thank you to IASCA who have brought this to our community, and just on finishing off, I'll just say that this exercise in bringing arts to the community gave the opportunity for people who would never normally engage in arts to become involved in it. The people that you've seen on the slides are people that probably wouldn't have come into our gallery. There is a sense of feeling intimidated to walk in there, although it's free, it's open, we're welcome. We like to drag them off the street sometimes. Come in, have a look, give us your opinion. And at the end of the day, someone said to me recently, a good friend of mine, I just don't understand art, but I know what I like. And I said, it doesn't have to be any more than that. So thank you. Thank you, Sonia and David. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I suppose that's it.